Good morning again. During the winter of 1940, Josephine Kuntz's husband, a house painter and textile worker, was temporarily unemployed because of the weather and a seasonal layoff. It was a difficult time for the family. They quite literally had no money. Their 18-month-old daughter, Rachel, was recovering from pneumonia and wasn't doing well. The doctor insisted Rachel eat a boiled egg each day, but even that was beyond their means. Why not pray for an egg, suggested a young friend. They were a church-going family, but the idea of actually praying for their needs was something that they never really considered. But Josephine wasted no time. On her knees, she prayed that God would provide an egg each morning for her daughter. Later that morning, Josephine heard some cackling coming from the hedge fence in front of their home. Among the bare branches sat a fat red hen. She had never seen this hen before and had no idea where it came from. She just watched in amazement as the hen laid an egg and then proceeded down the road. In a moment, the hen was gone, but an egg sat in the yard. Well, what do you do under such circumstances? But thank God. The next day, Josephine was startled once again to hear cackling in the hedge. The red hen came by every day for over a week and repeated this routine. Each day, little Rachel had a fresh boiled egg. The little girl got better, and the weather improved, and Josephine's husband went back to work. The next morning, I waited by the window and watched, Josephine says, but the little red hen did not return. Now, Jesus had just received some tragic news. His cousin, John the Baptist, had been put to death. There was a closeness between Jesus and John the Baptist. Jesus spent time with John in the desert before he began his ministry. And of course, John baptized Jesus. And now, John was dead. Matthew informs us that Jesus withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. In times of crisis, we all need solitude and prayer, don't we? Solitude is hard to find in our busy, hectic lives. We're forever on the go. Jesus needed time alone. He withdrew from the crowds. He sailed down along the shore of Galilee in search of a place where no one would bother him. He was setting an example for us. If having time away from the crowds was important for Jesus, think how important it is for us. 5 days a week for 8 weeks, former baseball pitcher Dave Dravecky drove 90 minutes each way for cancer treatment in Cleveland. At first, the trip seemed long and unbearable. Then Dave began to notice the beauty of lush summer foliage on both sides of the highway. This peaceful drive eventually wound through the Shaker Heights district, an older area with stately mansions. The daily trips were still monotonous, but Dave could almost make the drive in his sleep. Yet, these long drives became an opportunity for Dave Dravecky to grow in his faith. He'd think and pray and listen to tapes of his favorite Bible teachers. Sometimes he would listen to a tape of worshipful music and sing along with it. His voice isn't exactly the sound of music, Dave says, but the hills did seem to come alive. It was good, quality time when he would not be interrupted by the telephone or anything else. Those 8 weeks driving to and from the Cleveland Clinic saved Dave's life, his spiritual life. He needed that time alone, he says, with the Lord. He needed it desperately, maybe even more than the radiation. What was true for Dave Dravecky was also true of Jesus. He was strengthened by his time alone. He was strengthened by his time of prayer. What was true of Jesus It's also true of us. We need time for solitude and prayer. When Jesus returned from his time alone, he noticed that a large crowd was waiting for him, and Matthew tells us he had compassion on them and healed their sick. And that's the second thing we need to notice in this passage. Jesus cares about our needs. Jesus took time to heal the sick. He could have sent the crowds away. He could have said, "Don't bother me. Can't you see I'm grieving?" He could have ignored them and gone on his way. But he didn't. He stopped and healed them. There was a need, and Jesus responded in the only way he knew how, out of love. What a contrast there is between Jesus and his disciples. Jesus was full of compassion. The disciples were more concerned about convenience. It was getting late. The people would be getting hungry, and this presented a problem. The disciples approached Jesus with their concern. "This is a remote place," they said. "It's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." The disciples were being very practical. They didn't know what to do with such a large crowd. They knew they didn't have the means to feed them. The only reasonable solution was to send them to nearby villages. But Jesus had other ideas. It was one of those moments to trust that God would provide. There was no need for the disciples to worry. Everything was under control. Beryl David tells about a near tragedy that befell his 74-year-old Catholic grandfather. His grandfather was returning from an out-of-town mass one cold Saturday evening when his car broke down on an isolated stretch of road. As he got out of the car to check the engine, he fell badly and twisted his leg. When he tried to move, the pain was so excruciating that he nearly passed out. He lay helplessly on the road. The chance that someone might come along before morning was remote. Also, because of his precarious position, a passing motorist might run him over without realizing someone was there. As the frosty asphalt set his body of warmth, the old man decided that this was a very undignified way to die. He began to pray. Hours later, a young man driving a white car spotted Beryl's grandfather and expertly tended to him. His grandfather was, by then, nearly dead from exposure. The man took him to a local hospital. After making sure he was going to be all right, the man disappeared. The only thing the family was able to find out about this Good Samaritan was that he may have been a college student. An emergency room nurse said that the young man was wearing a jacket with Providence lettered on his back. No one has ever been able to convince Beryl's granddad that this particular fellow was merely connected with a university in Rhode Island. We know that God's providence does not always come that directly. Still, we know he cares. In times of distress, we seek solitude. Then we seek out a caring God. And finally, we trust that God not only cares, but that he is able to provide for all our needs. Have you ever noticed that the disciples are not always portrayed in a positive light in the Scriptures? There are times when it's obvious that they're not on the same wavelength as Jesus. And this was one of those times. Jesus told them to give the crowd something to eat. "What's that?" the disciples asked. Maybe they didn't hear him right. 5,000 people and only 5 loaves of bread and 2 small fish? Something just doesn't compute. The disciples look at each other in disbelief. Impossible. Only the best caterers with tons of food and plenty of notice could have fed a crowd that size. The disciples knew that the little bit of food they had would never be enough. But they were wrong. Little is always much when Jesus is involved. Jesus took the little bit of food they brought him, looked up to heaven, he gave thanks, and he broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, And in turn, the disciples gave the food to the crowd. You know the rest of the story. Everyone had enough to eat, and 12 baskets of food were left over. There are many places people are putting their faith nowadays. In their bank accounts, and taking care of their bodies, and education. And all of these are good things. The question is, are they enough? Several years ago, a United Press release in a Midwestern city told of a hospital where officials discovered that the firefighting equipment had never been connected. For 35 years, it had been relied upon for the safety of the patients in case of emergency. But it had never been attached to the city's water main. The pipe that led from the building extended 4 feet underground, and there it stopped. The medical staff and the patients had felt complete confidence in the system. They thought that if a blaze broke out, they could depend on a nearby hose to extinguish it. But theirs was a false security. Although the costly equipment, with its polished valves and well-placed outlets, was adequate for the building, it lacked the most important thing: water. So the thing says you are putting your faith in. Are you sure that they can provide an answer for those moments of deepest needs? The bank account, the healthy body, the good education are all valuable. But are they enough? Truth be told, only God is able to supply all our needs. Can't you imagine the expression of disbelief that must have been on the disciples' faces? They thought they didn't have enough, but Jesus proved they had plenty. Can't you see them punching each other in the arm afterwards saying, "Can you believe what just happened? Can you believe it? That was awesome." I think it's interesting that the feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle recorded in all 4 of the Gospels. The people present that day would remember these events for the rest of their lives. And no wonder. On that hillside long ago, Jesus gave his followers a foretaste of the heavenly banquet that is yet to come, a banquet prepared from the foundations of the earth for those who would believe in him. Alcoholics Anonymous and many other 12-step groups have helped people in many ways. The individual who is seeking help must first have the ability to acknowledge his or her inadequacy and powerlessness. A certain man has been sober for 8,774 days. He doesn't even seek to reduce it to months. He did not even talk about years. He has learned to live one day at a time. This man helps others who are struggling with problems like his. He goes to meetings and treatment centers to help people overcome their disease. En route, he always stops at a donut shop and buys some fresh donuts and a cup of coffee. One day, he thought that the other people who come to the meetings would like some donuts and coffee too. And so he bought some and took them with him. He said it was like having the sacrament when he shared those donuts and coffee with others in the group. At the close of the meeting, the members of this group came out into the middle of the room in a huddle, just like a sports team. Together they clasped hands as a team and sang, "Lean on me." When they finished singing, they stood up with a shout and were ready to go out and face the challenge of another day. On a hillside long ago, people ate bread and fish together, and they marveled at the love and the power of a simple teacher from Galilee. We don't know if they sang or shouted. We do know that this was a day that they would never forget. They had come away to be with Jesus. He cared for them, and he met their needs. And they experienced a foretaste of what will come, the heavenly banquet when we will all feast with Jesus. Will you please pray with me? Loving God, we give you thanks and praise that through Jesus you healed the sick and fed the hungry. With a few paltry fish and loaves of bread, you fed a crowd of famished people, and with grace to spare. We too long to be fed. We too clamor for your healing touch. We come to you in prayer now, pressing in on you from all sides with our needs and desires, some trivial, some profound. And through it all, you love us. You are attentive to the deepest yearnings and the most hidden wounds of our hearts. Attend to us once again, we pray. Amen.